Hello and welcome to the African World. I'm Kwame Clement reporting. Our special guest today, the President of the Republic of Botswana, His Excellency Seretse Khama Ian Khama. The World Bank has described Botswana as a remarkable development success story, and the bank could not be more correct. In just a few decades since independence in 1966, Botswana has transformed itself from an impoverished, rural cattle grazing society into a modern, democratic, relatively prosperous, middle-income country that is a shining example of what is possible in Africa. And obviously, to discuss Botswana, like we said, we have the president of that country with us on our program. Welcome, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Like I said, your country has had a remarkable record of development growth, posting 9% growth year after year after year since independence. And although growth rate slacking a little bit during the recent crisis, it is again on an upward trajectory. What explains Botswana's remarkable record?
At our independence in 1966, we were in the category of one of the poorest nations on the face of the earth. And you would then understand that as a result, the very little resources that we had to be used extremely carefully. And therefore, the leaders at that time became very conscious of the need to engage in economic prudence and to manage the very limited resources that we had to the best interests of our citizens. Coupled with, of course, the democracy which we have embraced, which stems from our own cultural system and traditional norms in the country, that this has stood us in good stead, and we would hope that it would be an example that could be followed by others.
And talking about your democracy a little bit, and how that has affected and shaped the democracy Botswana has today.
Well, I think the Khota system allows people come together in a public gathering, in a place, and they meet their chiefs, and issues will be put before the assembled, and they will be discussed, and people are free to say what they like. And at the end of the day, the chief would then, having listened to all the various opinions at that time, then come to a decision.
Let's come back to the economic issue a little bit more. The downturn affected the world at large, and it affected Botswana too. Growth rate, previously high, dropped some. Tell us a little about how your government responded to the economic downturn and what has been the results.
This downturn affected all economies, developed and developing. Whether you were single commodity dependent like we are with diamonds, or you had a country which had a very diversified economy. And what we had to do was ensure, first of all, that some of the major projects that we had started embarking upon, which were very important for our future development, for example, the provision of energy, electricity, the provision of water, that we continue to, we allow those projects to continue, that they shouldn't be halted. There were other projects we obviously had to halt, but these ones we continued as strategic. And by their very nature, they were very capital intensive, very expensive projects to undertake. And what we did was we did go to organizations like the ADB, the World Bank, and we got loans to be able to allow us to continue with those projects. And we did also draw down on some of our foreign exchange reserves in order to achieve that. And we came out with a plan by which we should, at the end of that plan period, have restored our budget to one of a balance, to come up with a balanced budget. And this year is the last year that we are projecting a deficit, with next year, as I said, should be the first year after this downturn where we are back with a balanced budget. And so far, fingers crossed, we are we are on course for achieving that. For now, as we speak, certainly the quantities and the prices of the diamond sales are improving.
And Your Excellency, what is Botswana doing to diversify its economic base to be less reliant on diamond in the long run?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say one thing, that the downturn affected even the most diversified economies. And because it just cut across, almost every commodity. We have been attempting to diversify our economy for several years now. And the one way of doing so is by attracting FDI, foreign direct investment. And of course, that depends on a number of factors, some which countries or companies who want to look at your stability, they look at your democracy, they look at the tax regime, they look at the infrastructure, and they look at the market. And some of the challenges we have as Botswana is that being landlocked with a small population, we cannot offer the type of market, with just under 2 million people, that would attract foreign direct investment. But we try to turn our being landlocked into an advantage, that we're actually there in the center of the Southern African subcontinent. And what we are doing, when you talked about the long term, is to greatly improve our communications links with the countries in our region. I'm talking about rail, we're talking about air links, we're talking about road links. And we have already started and embarked upon, in some cases completed very recently, some of the infrastructure that will help us to achieve that connectivity with the rest of the region, so that any investors coming in would know that they have got that outlet, and it is an efficient outlet to reach countries in the region, and including people like our neighbor in South Africa. Of course, they have a big advantage over us, and trying to compete with them for the same FDI is, of course, difficult, because they've got access to the sea, and they're a much more developed economy than we are. They've got a much huger market than we have, and that accessibility. But like I say, we are trying to turn our particular situation into an advantage. In the mineral sector, I think there we are doing quite well, because we have had a lot of prospecting going on in the country, and we have discovered a number of very exciting deposits of other minerals other than diamonds, like copper, silver, uranium, gas. We found quite interesting and exciting gas supplies, and of course we've got vast deposits of coal. So I think even in the mineral sector, away from diamonds, we will see in the next 3 to 5 years a lot of interesting developments in that regard.
And of course, adding value to diamond that you now produce too is another effort you're making to diversify the economy, polishing. And
yes, in fact, as you say, the beneficiation of diamonds, all the downstream activities arising from diamonds, that we shouldn't just be a producer, just mining diamonds, and that's it. That all the, as you say, cutting and the polishing and going into jewelry, and even the selling of the diamonds, and having the sales also taking place from Botswana and not just from London in that regard.
That's a competitive world out there, as you know. So if you were speaking directly to an American investor, why should he choose Botswana?
People do shy away from unstable regimes. Our corruption index is also very good. It's the best on the continent, and that's something else which we could assure them, that even from the world rankings, we are amongst the best performers. The recently produced Global Peace Index also rates Botswana 35 of about 150 countries. We even rate much better than the United States, for example. And we came out on top in Africa. Our foreign exchange controls are also very favorable. The tax regime, as I indicated to you earlier on. So these are all things that investors look at. And there are also other indexes like, doing business in a country. How much bureaucracy is there in place, which tends to frustrate people wanting to start up businesses. That is something which we are also working on improving.
And just one last question before we go to a break, then Khama and wrap up. You talked about your performance on the corruption index, and Transparency International that puts out the corruption index rates Botswana pretty high. And it is important to point out for our viewers that Botswana beats European member countries like Italy, Greece, Hungary, and others when it comes to corruption. And my question to you is, what policies, what mix of policies and institutions you have in place in Botswana that explain the country's strong performance when it comes to corruption?
The first thing is to have a goal. And our goal is to have zero tolerance of corruption. We have in place an independent directorate that investigates and prosecutes anybody who would be engaged in corruption. We have an autonomous procurement board who decide, who are not part of government. So we channel what we want to procure to that board. They are the ones who make the decisions on what can be procured, who to give tenders to for construction of roads, schools, or what have you. The political leadership is also totally divorced from the procurement chain. We have anti-corruption committees who are constantly engendering awareness of the negative effects and keeping a lookout for any attempts or opportunities for corruption that may exist. And in some places we have also transformed our normal internal audits in the ministries to also looking at issues of corruption. And we also have taken a decision that in that corruption body, we also have 2 or 3 expatriates all the time, bringing in new methods and ways that corruption can be fought from their experience in the countries they come from.
His Excellency Seretse Khama Ian Khama, President of the Republic of Botswana, our guest today on The African World. I'm Kwame Clement. We'll be back in just a moment. Hello and welcome back to The African World. I'm Kwame Clement reporting. Our guest today, the President of the Republic of Botswana, His Excellency Seretse Khama Ian Khama. And Mr. President, Botswana has one of the best social safety nets in Africa. And compared to the rest of the world, we say a fairly decent one. You provide free or heavily subsidized education and healthcare for the people of Botswana. Of course, when I say you, I mean the country. It's supposed to be tough on the budget, and it's a good policy objective. My question is, how long can Botswana afford this?
That's a good question. It is a bit of a trap that we may have fallen into. It has had the effect of creating what we call a dependency syndrome by some of our population on these government types of assistance and handouts. But I don't apologize for it, because as I described to you earlier, when we were one of the least developed countries in the world, we were one of the poorest, people's quality of life was very, very poor. And therefore, as the years went by and government's budgets improved, they sought to try to address the issues of providing those social safety nets for people at that time. And I think that now some of these, as you talked about, the health is heavily subsidized, education is heavily subsidized, our fuel is subsidized, you know, the services, water, electricity, all that. But in some cases, it's still perfectly justified. Even as much as we are trying to expand our electricity network to all corners of the country, but there is a limit to how much you can expect people to pay for that electricity, especially at the costs that we should be passing on to them. And so to a certain extent, government then has to come in and subsidize that cost. So for some time now, I think that will be that will be continuing. Even in the health sector, I still believe that you know, you can't have a situation where somebody who's in need of medical care can be turned away or not considered because they can't afford it. So we have kept our medical fees very low, and have just assumed that this is a responsibility that a government has to have, especially as we are still very much a developing nation. We still have our own share of poor people, people living in poverty who have to be assisted. And it'll be something that over time we will gradually wean people off that dependency. I mean, when we introduced school fees, for example, there was quite an outcry. It's not there at primary school, but only at secondary schools, and parents are only expected to pay up to 5% of their school fees, but they were still up in arms about it. And we only target those who can afford it. And if you've got 3 kids, only one of those 3 kids would you have to pay school fees for, not all 3 of them. But still, it's because people hadn't been paying school fees for forever, you know, ever since the beginning. I suppose that's human nature, that when you then start saying, oh, well, come on, there has to be some cost recovery. But gradually, as I say, this issue of cost recovery, we are embarking upon it more and more as the years go by.
Let's talk a little bit Botswana domestic politics. Your party, the Botswana Democratic Party, has won all elections held in Botswana since independence in 1966. It's probably not difficult to understand the reason why, given the country's economic performance. But you recently, the party that has lost some relatively key members who've joined the opposition. What does this mean for the party? How does it affect its hold on power?
Well, first of all, they were not key members. There were a few members of parliament who went away. These were people who were troublemakers in the party. When I came into office, the one thing I insisted on was discipline. And, you know, in the political arena, in every country, discipline is in short supply amongst politicians. They are amongst the worst people when it comes to, you know, teamwork. There is so much self-interest and selfishness. Yes, they will espouse that when they're an elected representative, they will always give the impression that they are coming into office to try and do the best they can for the people they represent. But, you know, you'll see them embarking upon trying to do good for their constituents. If they lose an election and they're out of it, all the sort of donations they used to get for football teams, for destitutes, they stopped doing. And you say, why? Was it generally that they were doing it for the people at the time because they were an elected representative, or was it for self-interest, in order to buy favor for themselves? And when self-interest becomes a dominant factor in your political career, and politics always brings out the worst in people's character. When self-interest is allowed to dominate, then people will resort to all sorts of things to serve themselves. And that's when discipline is compromised, because then they are just looking inwards and not thinking of the rest of the team. So these were people who were in that mold. And they broke off from the party because I took disciplinary action against some of their members. And they had colleagues or friends who were close to them who felt aggrieved by the fact. And we'd gone many years without any action being taken. And that allowed these instances just to continue to grow and grow and grow. And yet we always knew and always talked about it in our party congresses that, you know, these factions in our party are going to tear us apart, and something needs to be done. And people would always call out for action to be taken. Of course, they didn't expect to be taken against themselves. But anyway, when it came, then those groupings took offense to it, and someone decided that no, they were going to leave the BDP and form their own party, which they did. I said to myself, good riddance, good riddance. And the actions I took, even on hindsight, I don't regret, and I would do it again. Mm-hmm. Because ever since they've left, and I said it to other members of our party, that once we've got rid of these people, it doesn't matter how many go, we will be rid of the problem. And we have had relative peace and stability in the party ever since they left us.
Mm-hmm. Still on politics, sir, many people attribute Botswana's success to the foundations laid by its founding president, Sir Seretse Khama, who happens to be your father. What is it like walking in his very, very big footsteps?
It's difficult for a son to talk in the same terms that you have just described him, because I just assume most people will say, well, what would you expect him to say? But yes, I think he certainly has been recognized by all in the country for having laid the foundation of democracy and the economic success that we have become. It wasn't that long ago. You know, if you look at the age of the people in the nation, people still have very fond memories of him and what he did, and so yes, I suppose there were those who would have the same expectations, but one has to just try and do one's best, you know, under the circumstances they find at the time.
And he had a couple of remarkable men around. There was Maseri, who was, you know, really the technocrat, thinkering, grappling with the economic development issues. Then there were Mohai, who followed, who you serve as vice president, who I think was one of the persons by virtue of training and professional experience best qualified to lead any country in the world. He had been finance minister, he had been, you know, a permanent secretary at the finance ministry, he had worked at the World Bank, he had been vice president.
He was the governor of the bank.
Yeah, and the early leaders, you guys were very lucky in your early leaders, weren't you? I mean, the caliber and quality of men.
Yes. And I think that is why it was important that each one of them, you know, came to the table with those kind of qualifications that were embedded in their particular circumstances, and were able to then carry on the mantle, take on the baton, and carry it on. And like you say, I know Festus Mohai, the former president, much better because I served directly under him and his vice president, and he had a wealth of experience and knowledge.
I had the pleasant opportunity of visiting Botswana last year to do a documentary on the country, and I'm standing by the roadside just outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a jeep passes by. I had seen your pictures, I hadn't seen you, but as I lift my head up, I saw you in the front seat, recognized you were the president. There was one passenger in the back. There was no police escort, no armed guards. It's a rarity, you know, for a leader to travel that way in many parts of the world, particularly Africa. What does that say about Botswana's political culture? What does that say about your style of leadership?
Well, for Botswana, I think it's just another indication of the peace and stability that we enjoy, that a head of state can travel like that. For me, I'm allergic to security. That may sound strange, having been in the military. This was not my chosen career path, being in politics. Having people around me all the time, I find very uncomfortable. So whenever I can, I will take off with the minimum amount of people I have to. I will drive myself around town. That's how I am. And
you said politics wasn't your chosen path.
No.
Then why politics?
I was serving my country in the army. I know sometimes politicians would like to believe that theirs is the ultimate service, you know, being in politics, but that's a lot of nonsense. I think everybody out there in public service is serving their country just as well as any politician. I allowed myself to be persuaded by President Mohai to leave the army and join him as his vice president because of these factions I talked about that were in the party. And there were the way the factions were so divided, and it divided the party, for him to be able to come with somebody from either faction to be his vice president, the other would have opposed it. And so he decided to get a neutral candidate from outside the immediate arena to come in, and he picked on me. It was a big shock for me when he asked me, but it was something I knew my father had always said to me. He would like me to go into politics. And I remember the days when he used to sometimes mention it to me. I just used to say, it'll never happen. I've got no interest in going into that line of work. And from what I knew of politics, what I saw of it, how dirty politicians could be, you know, being in politics, I can confirm it's as bad as all that. But the thing is, in the government side of it, where you can actually put in place programs and policies that can benefit people, that is the part that appeals to me. And I've tried to use all my time and any time that I have remaining, that I will try to do as much as I can to benefit the people of Botswana.
And Botswana's experience is unique to it. Having said that, another way like you want to lecture other African leaders, but if you were just to speak to what they can learn from the Botswana experience, the Botswana model, what would you say?
It would have to be that they have to respond to the aspirations and expectations of the people. Is that the people out there expect of their governments, of their elected representatives, of anyone who's in authority, to work for them, the people. And all these problems we have on the continent is all because of the inward looking of some of these politicians. And for long as that kind of mentality exists, then we are going to always be seized with this problem, which arises from time to time.
On that note, I want to say thank you very much for joining us. It's been our pleasure having the President of Botswana, His Excellency Seretse Khama Ian Khama, on the African World. Today we covered the waterfront, Botswana's rise as an economic success in Africa, the policies and institutions the government has put in place to deal with corruption, how the country weathered the economic storm, effort to diversify the economy, what it's like being in politics, following the footsteps of his father, and of course what Africa can learn from the Botswana experience. Thank you so much, Mr. President. A pleasure. I'm Kwame Clement for the African World. Thanks for viewing. We'll see you next week on another edition of the program. So long.